Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Henning, and welcome to the Monday, April 19th, noon Project Homekey 2.0 info session. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague at the County of Marin, Howard Schwartz.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. Good afternoon. I'm going to do a short intro and then turn it back over to Andrew to present more details. Basically, this is an introduction information session to explain to you more about the state's Project Homekey, which was a response to protecting persons experiencing homelessness who are at high risk. It's also a way for the state to help local communities acquire properties to put more units available for those who are experiencing homelessness. This was launched last summer. We were still at the height of the pandemic. It was very rapid turnaround. You'll hear more about that. Marin was able to acquire 2 properties, one in Corte, Madera, and one in San Rafael. You'll see photos of those, I think, and get a little more info. Those properties became interim housing with the intent after a period of time to become what we call PSH, or permanent supportive housing. The reason we're doing these information sessions now is the governor's requested a second tranche of funding, $750 million. And last time we really didn't have enough time to educate the community and get the community's participation. And that's what these information sessions are intended to do. The real goal of Project Homekey is to create more units of housing for those who are experiencing homelessness. Just to remind you where we're at in Marin, in January 2019, we had a point in time count, and we had just over 1,000 residents who were experiencing homelessness. We couldn't do a regular point in time count this January because of the pandemic. We just did a vehicle count, and the numbers are up on the vehicle count, but that's probably a sign of people who are just entering homelessness. It doesn't mean the overall number of homeless has gone up. You may have been noticing more people who are experiencing homelessness in the encampments, and the great majority of those experiencing homelessness in Marin were Marin residents before they became homeless. The vast majority of people who experience homelessness are from this county. Marin was the only county that actually reduced chronic homelessness between 2017 and 2019. So we were doing something right. We were using a housing first methodology, which you'll hear more about, and we had a whole coalition of partners working together on this. Just maybe one fact as background: when we started this new methodology, we had 193 units for those experiencing homelessness. And it's now, in 2020, was increased to 514 units. So we've been aggressively increasing the number of units. This is a new funding opportunity, and to tell us about it and explain how it works is Andrew Henning. Andrew, I started working with when he was director of homeless planning and outreach at the city of San Rafael. He's now the project director of our new Opening Doors, a nonprofit, which is public-private partnership of a number of organizations across Marin focusing on addressing chronic and veteran homelessness. So Andrew, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Howard. And thank you everyone for joining today. I am going to share my screen here. So bear with me while I pull it up. And Howard, if you wouldn't mind maybe watching the chat and helping with that. I can't see it while I'm screen sharing, so just so everyone knows. So welcome to today's Marin Homekey 2.0 info session. We're going to be talking about this program in a little bit more detail. Again, I'm Andrew Henning with Opening Doors, and this is Howard Schwartz with County HHS, Health and Human Services, and the Whole Person Care Team. Howard, maybe if you want to drop your email and my email in the chat, if people have questions or comments that you want to ask us directly or you don't feel comfortable saying with the group, feel free to just shoot those to us, and we're happy to get back to you. A couple housekeeping items. All sessions are going to be recorded. If you joined a little bit late, this session is currently being recorded. Following the presentation, we'll be answering questions from the chat. We're not going to be doing a live audio Q&A, but we'll answer questions from the chat. So feel free to drop those in, send your questions to panelists. We're also going to have a survey at the end of the presentation to get your feedback on what you hear today about Homekey 2.0. Importantly, this presentation is focused on Homekey 2.0. We're going to talk briefly about homelessness overall in Marin, as Howard kind of mentioned a little bit, but this presentation is primarily about Homekey, not homelessness overall, but we'll do our best to answer any questions. I don't expect it, but if we do get quote unquote Zoom bombed, we will end the session, and I have everyone's email address so we can follow up and schedule another session if that were to happen. And then lastly, there's a lot more information on the county website, marincounty.org/main/homekey. There's a FAQ from Homekey 1.0, as well as more information about what's going on now. And so if you have other questions, feel free to go to that site. In terms of the agenda for today, we're doing welcomes and introductions right now. We're going to talk, as I said, briefly about homelessness in Marin overall. We're going to talk briefly about opening doors Marin, and then most of the presentation is going to be focused on Homekey, and then Q&A about Homekey, any questions that you might have. So let's jump right into homelessness in Marin. So I have a 45-minute version of this presentation, so I could go on and on about this, but I'm going to give you the 5-minute abridged version. So again, feel free to ask any questions. This process for us, our new system for addressing homelessness in Marin, really began in 2016. And to build on some of the stuff that Howard said, what we realized back at that time was that of all the various challenges related to homelessness, most of the most pressing community challenges were related to a small group of people experiencing chronic homelessness. And when I talk about challenges, what I mean is if you were to imagine people who were temporarily, briefly homeless to people that were long-term chronically homeless, what studies locally as well as all across the country have found is that for people that are long-term chronically homeless, the cost of people being unhoused is actually very substantial. It can be $60,000 per person per year. And that comes from emergency medical visits, EMS transport, maybe other emergency services or public safety services. And so that really is how we think about this small number of people experiencing chronic homelessness. At the same time, these are also some of the most vulnerable people in the community. And so morally, ethically, we feel compelled to want to address this group. Everyone experiencing homelessness is vulnerable, but studies have found that people experiencing chronic homelessness pass away on average 25 years earlier than their housed peers, not from acute weather or other events like that, but from long-term chronic illness that goes untreated. And so again, this is really a group that's extremely vulnerable and is really in need of help and resources. What we found back in 2016 is that we had a lot of great programs and services, but a lot of those services were focused for this part of the curve, and we weren't really doing a lot to address chronic homelessness. So what did we do? We convened a group of stakeholders from the city, the county, local service providers, and we hit the road. We went up to Sonoma County, down to the South Bay, to the East Bay. We took our leaders, as I mentioned, to look at different models that communities were pursuing for addressing chronic homelessness. And I'm glad Howard's part of this session because in addition to all of that kind of external field trip work, we also started internally to map our local system of care. And the details of this map are less specific than the kind of overall takeaway, which is that homelessness is denoted here in the middle and housing's on the outside. And what we realized is that we'd created a very convoluted system where it was very hard for people experiencing chronic homelessness to actually get to the outside to housing. And so the result was that we had a system and a cycle where we had people that were inherently difficult to serve, whether because of underlying behavioral health issues, traumatic brain injuries, other health issues, substance abuse disorders, often many of these challenges at the same time. We had created well-intentioned programs that, even though they were well-intentioned, they had barriers that were making it hard for people who were chronically homeless to actually be successful. So they were failing out of these programs, they weren't seeking help, and their condition was getting worse. And this cycle, in some cases, had been playing out for 30, even 40 years for some individuals in our community. So what we realized from all of our field trips is that we didn't need just like another substance abuse program or behavioral health program. We needed a whole new strategy for helping these folks. And the program that we finally landed on was called the Homeless Outreach Team, or the HOT program. And this was based off of a program in San Mateo County that we've now implemented here and has been named a statewide best practice by the League of California Cities. And the idea was that we brought together all of our different service providers, city, county, housing authority, nonprofits, And we worked off a by name list of the most visible, vulnerable people in our community. We started with just a dozen. And the result was that we really, is again, from our learnings of going on our field trips, was that rather than trying to have people navigate that maze of services, we wanted to get people directly into housing through a process called Housing First. Housing First is a nationally researched and recognized model that in some cases is 200, even 300% more effective than having people having to navigate that maze that Howard and I had mapped out before. And so the result was that for the first 18 months of that pilot, we housed 23 of the most visible, vulnerable, chronically homeless people, specifically in downtown San Rafael. And because of that success, we started to ask ourselves, could this become a countywide solution? And on October 1st of 2017, we officially launched what we call coordinated entry, which is the countywide version of this program. And that system, and again, I could talk more about this, and I would encourage you to check out this organization, Community Solutions, and their Built for Zero campaign. They're helping communities all across the country, over 80 communities at this point, to actually implement these by name lists for helping the most vulnerable, visible, chronically homeless people in communities all across the country. In fact, they actually just got awarded I don't know if it was an actual MacArthur Genius Award, but they got $100 million from the MacArthur Foundation because of the work that they're doing nationally to end chronic and veteran homelessness. So we joined this, and the impact was almost immediate. From 2017 to 2019, I think Howard mentioned this, but we had an almost 30% reduction in chronic homelessness, which was almost directly correlated with the new permanent supportive housing units that we were creating. Since October 1st of 2017, we've now housed over 320 of the most visible, vulnerable, chronically homeless individuals and families in Marin County. And this number is a little bit out of date, but our current retention rate is 94% for all the people that we've housed since the start of that program. And at least for San Rafael, we've seen major reductions in service utilization, which again was one of our core hypotheses in starting this whole approach originally. So how do we do this? I get this question all the time. Surprisingly, the most impactful way that we've been helping people is a partnership with the Marin Housing Authority to connect people with Section 8 vouchers and intensive services. So the majority of people that we've housed have been housed in scattered site rentals all across the county, from Mill Valley to Novato, Larkspur, even out to Inverness. And so there are hundreds of people that are already in our neighborhoods, in our community, that were previously chronically homeless, who are now thriving in housing with this model. But of course, rentals are not enough alone. So we've also been pursuing more long-term affordable housing projects, like last year, this project in Fairfax, Victory Village, which was for low-income seniors, launched, and we were able to carve out some of those units for our permanent supportive housing goal. Homeward Bound in Marin, which some of you may know, is also in the process of rebuilding the Mill Street shelter in San Rafael to allow for 32 more units. And so these are projects that really demonstrate that we're trying to create more housing. And that's really what Opening Doors Marin is all about. So Opening Doors Marin, just briefly, started in 2017. At that time, we were calling it the Marin Chronic Homeless Action Task Force, or MCHAT for short. And from 2017 to 2018, the purpose of MCHAT was really to bring together all these different stakeholders, different cities, the county, philanthropy, service providers, faith-based, to really educate them about the success we were having, about Built for Zero, about Housing First. And what we realized at the end of that education period was that the biggest challenge for us really was around creating more housing. And the biggest bottleneck for that was not having enough local capital or enough local money to be able to pursue projects. So in early 2019, our MCHAT rebranded itself as Opening Doors Marin and became a 501c3 fiscally sponsored project under CVNL, or the Center for Volunteer and Nonprofit Leadership. In 2019, we spent the bulk of that year exploring the feasibility of a public revenue campaign. So this was something that communities throughout the region and the state have pursued to come up with more local capital to be able to pursue projects. And again, what I think is important, especially in Marin, is that we find that people really want to have local community control over housing, and having this local funding is a way for us to do that. Ultimately, however, there wasn't enough political support to pursue a public revenue measure. And so Opening Doors shifted to focusing on what we call our community business plan. So using all the data that we have around homelessness to really project out how much housing, how many services do we need to end chronic homelessness, and can we get philanthropic or other private donors to help support this? And then there's Homekey 1.0, which I'll get to in a minute, which was not part of the plan, but was something that Opening Doors was involved with. If you're curious in learning more about Opening Doors, or you can go to openingdoorsmarin.org. But also there is this organization that I've been telling people about called Destination Home. And this is a similar kind of public-private nonprofit that's based in Santa Clara County that's probably 10 years ahead of us, but they've done a lot of this work around having community metrics and data around homelessness, as well as doing, trying to come up with public revenue options, and then also doing a lot of fundraising with the tech sector and other industry partners to raise money to create more housing. So Homekey 1.0. So in order to understand Homekey 1.0, we have to look at the confusingly named predecessor, Project Roomkey, which was the state's initial response to COVID-19 for people experiencing homelessness. So shortly after shelter in place started in March of 2020, the state announced Project Roomkey, which basically had the goal of helping communities rapidly lease hotel and motel rooms to create what's called non-congregate shelter capacity. So congregate shelter capacity, you can imagine, would be like a big, let's say, church hall where people are sharing that space together. That's obviously not a good environment during COVID. And so the state wanted communities to be able to rapidly lease hotel and motel rooms to get people off the street, because a lot of those underlying health reasons that I talked about earlier. This program was able to help over 22,000 people across the state, with almost every county and even tribal nation governments participating. Because of this program, just a few short months later, in June, the state announced Project Homekey. And Project Homekey was a reallocation of the state's federal coronavirus relief funding allocation. And there was an extremely rapid turnaround that Howard mentioned earlier. But basically, the state announced this program in June, notice of funding availability came out in July, and then applications were due less than a month later. The funding could be used for the acquisition and rehab or reuse of hotels, motels, and other commercial buildings, as well as other creative housing projects. But the caveat was that the buildings had to be purchased by the end of the calendar year and operational within 90 days. So these were really rapid turnaround. And again, part of that was because the federal government was trying to have states use this money. Ultimately, the program served about 9,000 people, and communities were able to acquire 6,000 units. So again, really this rapid acquisition, rapid move-in. And when you think about the fact that there are 150,000 people experiencing homelessness in California, a program like this can make a really big difference. Locally, Howard mentioned we were able to secure 2 projects in Marin County through Project Homekey 1.0. One was 3301 Kerner, which is in San Rafael. It was a commercial building, which is being rehabbed to permanent supportive housing. And then the other was what's being called the Casa Buena in Corte, Madera, which was previously a hotel. And both of these sites, as Howard mentioned, have created, there were 44 units at 3301 Kerner and 18 units plus a manager's unit here at the Casa Buena. And I do want to acknowledge, because I'm sure it's on the mind of folks that maybe have joined today, is that, typically when we do affordable housing projects or any housing project in the community, there's a lot of community engagement, a lot of planning, many steps along the way where there's community feedback and council or city or town oversight. Homekey is much, much faster than that. And it's much faster than I think any of us would have imagined. And so when Homekey 1.0 came out, there was a lot of concern from residents and community members about how is this actually going to go? What is the impact going to be? Is this really a good idea for our community? And so the town of Corte Madera, to their credit, following Homekey 1.0 and the acquisition of that project, the Casa Buena, created a community kind of oversight advisory committee, which involves town council members, community providers, community residents, that's providing guidance to this project in terms of community communication, external redesign ideas, measuring success, developing volunteer opportunities. And so one of the things that this group has done is put together this virtual ribbon cutting video. And so I wanted to just share this briefly with you to see what's possible from one of these Homekey projects. So I'm going to play the short video for you.
On behalf of Corte Madera's elected officials, staff, and residents, I'd like to welcome you to the Casa Buena, Corte Madera's first permanent supportive housing for those that experience homelessness. This was all brought together by a collaborative effort that included the County of Marin, Catholic Charities, Open Door Marin, town staff, and Corte Madera residents, who are also providing monetary and in-kind donations.
Marin has worked very hard over the past 3 years to address our homeless population. And with the Homekey project in Corte Madera at Casa Buena, we will be able to provide needed housing for 18 of our most vulnerable residents while wrapping all the services the county has to offer around them. I want to thank the community of Corte Madera, their city council, and the Casa Buena Steering Committee for working with the county to make this possible.
When I first heard of plans to build a homeless shelter in Corte Madera, I was very much opposed to it. It wasn't until I did a bunch of research on my own that I began to realize that permanent supportive housing can be an important solution to the homeless issue we have here in Marin County.
A safe home helps transform lives and creates essential stability, healing, independence, and dignity founded on hope. Our partnership with Marin County through Project Roomkey and Homekey impacts many lives. Together, we strive to end homelessness in Marin.
From Corte Madera to Novato, Larkspur to Inverness, we have successfully housed hundreds of our community's most vulnerable chronically homeless people. Because of projects like this and the support of community members like you, I know we can reach our goal of being the first county in the Bay Area to end chronic homelessness.
One of the ideas we had was to create welcome baskets that could be given to each new resident when they move in. So we sent people shopping for everything from toothpaste to shampoo to snacks, cozy slippers, and grocery store gift cards. And the response from the community was frankly overwhelming. So many people wanted to be a part of this. It really embodies the spirit of Corte Madera as a welcoming place.
So on behalf of Corte Madera, I'd like to welcome our newest residents.
Welcome to Corte Madera!
So as you can see, there's really a way that these projects can be very rapidly integrated and embraced in the community. And I don't think Scott would mind me saying this, but he was someone, as he said in the video, who was initially skeptical and even opposed to this. And through this committee has come around and really seen the value of having this in the community. And that group, which is actually being facilitated by Opening Doors Marin, I don't know if I mentioned that, but they really see this being a model for future projects in Marin, even being a national model potentially for how communities can come around permanent supportive housing. So Homekey 2.0. So it's important to first say that there actually is no official current Homekey 2.0 yet. At this point, as Howard mentioned, the governor has proposed an additional $750 million for a possible Project Homekey for this current calendar year. But the legislature has not taken action yet. But we expect that it could happen as early as next month, actually. And given the rapid turnaround in the first Homekey, that the funding announcement, like last time, could come out as early as next month as well. So we're having these sessions because, as I said here at the last bullet, we really want to be proactive. It was very hard to be proactive the first time around, just given the speed of Homekey 1.0. And when we found out about it, but this time around, we really want to involve the community and get your feedback about the process. Because there is no official Homekey 2.0, there aren't official programmatic guidelines. So what I'm going to share moving forward is basically an assumption of what the program could look like based on what Homekey 1.0 looked like. So first, and again, this is assumed state criteria, cities, counties, housing authorities, tribal governments, those need to be the lead entity. So government agencies need to be the lead entity. The application can include other partners like service providers, nonprofit developers, in fact, actually for-profit developers as well, but it needs to have a government agency lead. Just like Homekey 1.0, we expect the funding to be flexible and for the acquisition or conversion of various housing types, ranging from commercial, hotel motels. We've even seen that communities can purchase tiny homes or trailers or other things with the goal of creating permanent housing. Just like last time, we expect that the program is going to expect communities to close by the end of the calendar year, 2021, and that they're also going to expect sites to be at least 50% occupied within 90 days. And then the last piece that I have not mentioned is it's going to require a local funding match. So this funding match is actually very important. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes going into it. So the way that the subsidy works is on a by unit or per unit acquisition cost. So depending on the per unit acquisition cost, this is how the subsidy works. So from $0 to $100,000, the state fully covers the cost of the acquisition. For $100,000 to $200,000, the state still covers the first $100,000, but then it would be a one-to-one match, state to local. So $50,000 from the state, $50,000 locally. And then lastly, from $200,000 to $350,000, it becomes a 1-to-2 match. So $50,000 state, $100,000 local. So in total, the total subsidy for a fully subsidized project from the state would be $200,000 from the state, $150,000 locally. That doesn't mean that a program or you couldn't pursue a project that was more costly than $350,000 per unit, but it becomes 100% financed locally above $350,000. So to put this in very practical terms, for a 50-unit project costing $200,000 per unit, the state would contribute $150,000 per unit, and we would contribute $50,000 or about $2.5 million. If the per unit cost went up just $90,000, you can see that locally we would have to pay $110,000 per unit or $5.5 million. And when we go back to why Opening Doors was created in the first place, the lack of local capital for housing, this can become a potential barrier. So I just wanted to name this so everyone can see the mechanics of how this works. So locally, in addition to the state criteria, this is also some of the draft local criteria that we're hoping to get feedback on. The first is that we're not looking for projects that are in areas of concentrated poverty or areas like the Canal or Marin City. And there's two reasons. Number one, I think, is just, ethically, we're trying to really move to create projects that are in communities all across the county that are in areas of high opportunity and are different income levels. So that's number one. But number two is also operational and practical, and it goes back to the financing. So the Marin Housing Authority, as I mentioned, has been a huge partner for allocating vouchers, housing vouchers, to our housing efforts. And housing vouchers are not free housing, even though sometimes they're thought of as being free housing. A housing voucher means that a person pays 30% of their income, whatever that income is, to housing, and then the subsidy covers the rest up to market rate. That's important because that subsidization then allows for these projects long-term to pay for operational costs like property maintenance, even security in some cases, as well as services. So we don't want to put people in housing without services. So that's very important, is that we need to find projects that allow for housing vouchers to be used. To that end, we're also looking for projects that are geographically distributed throughout the county. So we don't want to just crowd projects into one community. We want to make sure that we're covering the whole county. Also, we want to try to look for projects that would allow for the participation of nonprofit developers. Why is that important? So as I mentioned, the Homekey subsidy is for acquisition, not necessarily rehabilitation. And rehabilitation can be very costly. And so one way that we're looking to finance rehabilitation is with the help of what's called low-income tax credits. So that's a funding source that nonprofit developers can pursue. And so for nonprofit developers to make it work financially for them, they often need projects that are about 45 units or larger. I don't want to just immediately say that that's like a rule, because there could be projects that are smaller and cheaper that we can make work. But we're generally this time around looking for projects that are 45 units or larger. As I mentioned, cost-wise, we're definitely looking for projects that are $350,000 or less per unit, and ideally $250,000 or less in order to be able to maximize our local funding that we do have. And then lastly, we're not looking for projects that are in the middle of nowhere. We want to make sure projects are near services like grocery, transit, or healthcare. And the reason for that is both, again, that's a good project. We want to integrate people in the community. And it's also something that the state requires to make sure that we're actually placing people next to these different services. Howard, yeah.
Hey, Andrew, I just want to let you know, if somebody had a drop off, couldn't hear you, they're coming back in. So just watch if you need to admit them.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, so I think that's all the draft criteria locally that we're considering right now. So next steps. So this is info session 5 of 10. We're doing 10 info sessions. They'll all be recorded. They'll all be put online to answer any questions or comments that people might have about the process. The county is also planning to release a formal request for interest. So this would be to property owners throughout the county that might be interested in selling their property for the purposes of Homekey 2.0. As I mentioned, we're trying to get community feedback on the process, on the criteria. And then ultimately, we're trying to move again quickly. We don't know when the Homekey 2.0 is going to be approved or when a notice of funding availability would come out. But we would want to then vet those projects with our funders, with our local developer partners, and see if they're feasible. And then again, any final due diligence to see if a project would actually work, and then be prepared to submit applications. We also have, I just want to let people know, we have a couple other options for community engagement. I know the city of Novato, I think next week is doing a city council meeting that's agendized this. So if there are other forums where people would like information, definitely reach out and we can talk about that. So lastly is a survey. So I'm going to show the link here in a second, but I'm going to also copy it and then paste it into the chat. So we're just, it's a very short survey, probably 3 to 5 minutes. Again, we're asking about feedback on the general criteria we're pursuing. What are factors that would lead you to support a Homekey site, factors that would lead you to oppose it or have concerns about it, and then actual project ideas that you might have. So I am going to, this is the link. I'm going to stop sharing and copy the link into the chat so you don't have to worry about copying it here. And as I'm doing that, that concludes the presentation. So it looks like we have a lot of activity in the chat. So I'll turn it over to Howard first to maybe MC this, and then we'll start answering questions that you might have. So thank you for listening to that. Howard, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I think I've answered a lot of them online, but Andrew, one question was, what can people do? So I think you partly answered that, but people want to support this. What can they do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's been, I think, a common question at every presentation we've done, which is great. And I would just say that at this stage of the game, we're really trying to get the word out that this is even happening. So there's been an IJ article at this point, a Patch article. The county's reached out to all the cities and towns, to their public information officers. We're really trying to get the word out that we're doing these info sessions, that we're looking for projects, and that we really would love community feedback about the criteria that we should consider when looking for these projects. So I would really encourage, if there are people that you know that might be interested in this, either way, however they feel free to share a link to some of the upcoming events, or they can watch the videos, they can email me, they can email the county, and then I've also dropped the survey link in the chat. So feel free to share that as well, even if people did not attend the event. There's an option to say I didn't attend the event, just so we know, or an info session. Any other questions, Howard, do you think? What about this Q&A one from Angela? What accounts for the 94% retention rate? What are some of the reasons a housed person returns to an unhoused situation? Howard, do you want to talk about that first, or?
Yeah, I put something. I put something in the chat and then realized not everybody was seeing it. But across the country, the retention rate means that somebody stays housed. The average across the country is 85%. So actually, Marin is doing well better than the and then the national expectation of best practice. Things can happen to people in their lives. I mean, we have populations who've been homeless for, in some cases, 20, 30 years. Some people, it's a hard adjustment to get used to living in housing. So some people have a hard time with that adjustment. Some people still struggle with their addictions if they fall out. We give another go at it. So we don't give up on anybody. We put them at the top of our list, and we continue to engage with them and try to give them another shot at housing.
That's great. And I see, I think Howard maybe tried to answer some of this in the chat, but just to frame it again, I think from Karen, some questions about maybe people's openness to housing, or people, if there needs to be a conservatorship. I'll speak to this first, and then Howard, feel free to add to this. It is a common thing that I hear sometimes, that people might think that people experiencing homelessness are choosing to be homeless. But in my experience, at least from 11 years of doing this now, the vast majority, I would say 98% plus of people want to be in housing. Sometimes it can take a while for people to be open to that opportunity again. Part of it is that systemic failure, honestly, that I shared earlier, and that many people have tried to get housing in the past. The system failed for them or broke down in some way, and thus they are distrustful of the system. So it can be a process to get people back inside. Also, there are some people, as I think you kind of alluded to in your question, that really do, because of behavioral health issues or other things, have a hard time even recognizing that maybe they're sick or they're ill or that they need help. And so that can be a very challenging group of folks to work with. But again, that's a group that we really prioritize through our process to make sure that they are being supported. I think we very rarely end up in a situation where there is a conservatorship. I'd say of all the people that we've housed through our Housing First efforts, maybe 5% or less need that kind of level of support. So it's really about engaging people. And I think the other thing that sometimes I think can be a little confusing is people will say they want housing, but they don't want shelter. And that can be sometimes because, as I mentioned, just the congregate shelter setting or other places, there might be a trauma in a person's past, or there might be an inability to, let's say, bring a pet or an animal inside. So there can be like just operational barriers that a program or a more transitional option cannot accommodate that an actual long-term housing would instead. So,
yeah, I think we didn't really say much about, we wrap these units, the people who move into these units, with wraparound services, depending on what they need. Everybody gets a housing case manager who has a small caseload and really is there to support people in their transition. And then if needed, they have addiction support, behavioral health support, and a variety of other wraparound services to help them succeed.
Absolutely.
There's some questions.
Yeah, Melissa. So once property owners show interest, what would the timeline be for the city and community to be informed? So we did talk about in setting up this process that the original idea that we had was, well, let's just like find sites and then we'll do these community info sessions around the actual sites. What we realized is that in regular real estate kind of transactions, a lot of times property owners or property sellers, prospective sellers, if they announce that they're going to sell a site, it can, cause issues with current tenants or current occupants, or it can kind of put things in a weird position before it's even clear that there's agreement about the sale. And so what we decided to do instead is that rather than trying to, at this stage, identify specific projects and then share that through those info sessions, we're instead trying to identify the more high-level criteria that communities across the county would be willing to support for these projects. So as I mentioned, projects that are near services as being an example. And so we haven't fully reviewed the survey yet, but through the survey, there is a way to, designate the city or town where you live. And so if there's any more kind of refined feedback about, what you think would make a successful project in your community, that would be a great place to share that feedback. I do see a specific question about the Inn at Marin and Novato site. So that was the third site that we had applied for in 2020. And again, ultimately, I think what's so dynamic about this process is that In the end, while communities can, so let me make sure I say this right. So originally with public monies, the community was not trying to spend more than the appraised value of a site. And so while communities can spend over that, that's a very, fine line around how communities use public monies. And that was ultimately a decision that was up to the Board of Supervisors. And so that project ended up not moving forward because financially the seller of that site and the county, they couldn't reach an agreement on that price. So that's part of the due diligence that's happening up front around making sure that we understand when a property owner says they want to sell, well, how much are you selling for? Is it actually available? Are you going to throw a curveball later? Not to say that happened, but, is there going to be a curveball later around, the price changing or something like that? So basically the short answer is we're trying to do a lot more of that due diligence up front before applying, rather than last time where we applied and then had to do a lot of that due diligence on the back end. And that was honestly how the Homekey grant was designed. It was just like, submit your ideas and then we'll try to figure out if it's viable. This time around, we're trying to do more of that on the front end. The other thing I'll say, and Howard, feel free if you want to add anything to this, is that like last time, once we knew that we had viable sites, we started doing community engagement. We want to start that as soon as possible as well. I don't have exact timelines or kind of process updates at this point, but I think our thinking is that we want to involve the community for whatever application sites as early as possible to make sure that there's feedback and engagement around what that project looks like. And then Karen's question as a follow-up. So if a property sounds good to you, who in government reviews? So as I mentioned, the Homekey legislation or the Homekey funding notice basically allowed for cities, counties, and other government agencies to be the lead applicant. In parallel with that could be other programs. So it could have been like social service providers, it could have been nonprofit developers. And then beyond even that, locally, we also have cities and towns that have their own local funding pools for housing acquisition. There's Marin Community Foundation, other philanthropic groups that have funding for housing acquisition. So basically, there's a team of those different groups and entities that as we get more project ideas, we'll be reviewing those project ideas with those groups to determine, can we provide services there? Financially, can we make this program work long-term? Because we don't want there to be a cliff even 10 years out. We want to make sure that these programs are funded into perpetuity. And does the project or do the projects that we've received meet our criteria of being, a broad community portfolio? So basically it's a broader team. Yeah.
And I don't know if we mentioned it this time, Andrew, but there's also requirements that come from the state. It has to be within a certain distance of transportation and groceries. And so some of those constraints also apply.
Yeah. And I would say, if a city or town wanted to have more control over the site that they chose, they could always be the lead applicant. So that's always an option, that the city or town is the lead, and then, the county is a co-applicant or however that might look. There was also, I want to make sure, because Melissa did ask this directly about the inn at Marin, is it back on the table? At this point, at least from what I've seen, there has not been some indication from the seller that it's back on the table. That's not to say that couldn't change, but I've not, maybe when the county has their request for interest, that could change, but right now, no.
Karen's asking, would a criterion be that the motel causes problems in the community, like crimes being there? I don't think that's not a criterion that's weighed from the county's perspective, but the city or the local jurisdiction might favor it for that reason. So that could influence how the public and the community feels about it.
That's a great point. And I would add that one of the pictures that we showed at the beginning was from Sonoma County, where there was the leaders that were in a room. That was actually a former motel that had been converted to permanent supportive housing for people experiencing chronic homelessness, as well as veterans. And that had been a site where there actually had been historically problems there with crime and other kind of blight related issues. And the result was that those problems really diminished once the permanent supportive housing became the primary function there. So I think it's good to add to the survey. I don't know that we can always guarantee it, but I know that that's actually been a really positive thing in other communities for site identification.
How about law enforcement, Andrew? Are they involved in review?
Law enforcement is not currently involved in review. It's a good point. I think that would be something that is worth adding to, if you have feedback for the survey, to add that as a thought around, just at least considering that. So I think to what I said previously, if there are sites that are currently causing issues in the community, and there's a willing seller, I think it's really a win-win, because like I showed during the presentation, some of the stats, we do see reductions in that kind of behavior once people are housed and connected with services. So those can be good projects. Wendy's asking, is building tiny homes on a plot of land being considered? And the answer to that is yes, that could be an allowable use for a project. The key is going to be where. So conceptually, and Opening Doors has actually been very involved with this as well. We've been trying to work with the faith-based community for at least 2 years now to identify possible land or sites where we could put tiny homes or pallet homes or other kind of innovative small housing types. The question again really is where. So what's interesting with the Homekey funding is that our understanding is that the funding, the acquisition funding, could actually be used for paying for the tiny homes or paying for the shipping containers or whatever it is. But we also need the land. And so if there are ideas for, is there a faith-based community or another site that could be used as the land, then that would definitely be of interest. And I would encourage you to submit that through the feedback survey. And then the other thing I think is just important to, again, remember is that we need to make sure that whoever's supplying the tiny homes or whoever the proposed kind of partner vendor is that they can actually get them built and ready to live in within at least 50% of them within 90 days of closing on the site. So the state is wanting rapid turnaround for move-in. So short answer is yes.
There's a question, Andrew, from Kevin about is there any consideration for reimbursing cities or counties for loss of transit occupancy, sales, or property taxes? So just for everybody, maybe explain what transit occupancy tax is.
Yeah, that's a great question. So like a transit occupancy tax is a tax that people pay when they stay in a hotel or motel. It's just kind of like that's a traveler out of the community tax. Sales tax would obviously be just buying things in the community, or property tax would be taxes on the property itself. So yes, that is a possibility that a city or town could potentially lose out on transit occupancy tax or other types of taxes. So that is a consideration. I know that was a consideration before for some of these projects that we were looking at. Is that going to be a substantial impact on the community? I think what's interesting now, as we begin to kind of reemerge out of the pandemic and shelter in place, is, are hotels and motels going to be used in the same way moving forward? Are commercial properties going to be used? Office space, is that going to be used the same way moving forward? So there could be, I don't want to say there's an argument, because there's not. I think just, the broader context is important, because as those demands change, maybe taxes would be changing anyway. So the short answer is yes, taxes could be impacted, but we're also trying to identify sites where I think the community is not losing a productive asset as is.
And it's worth mentioning too, as you talked about earlier, Andrew, there's all sorts of hidden costs in homelessness to the cities, right? So there's enormous savings for each person, to the cities and to healthcare and to the police and fire and so forth. Also the fire risk, getting people housed, so, and then of course, the cities are under pressure from the state to increase their units for low-income housing. So that's also a pressure that if local jurisdictions don't respond to, then they may lose control. So this is also a way to keep control over local jurisdiction expansion.
That's a really great point. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, just to Karen's point, that was definitely a concern for the Nevada project last time. Was a pretty active hotel. and there would have been a TOT loss there. So it is a factor for sure. These are great questions. This might be one of the best groups yet. So really appreciate these super thoughtful questions. It's looking like we've answered most of them. I don't know if anyone has any kind of final questions or thoughts. Again, let me see. Looks like Michelle does. Feel free to type that in. I'm gonna repaste the link to the survey in the chat. So feel free to fill that out afterwards and add again, great feedback in the comments. So feel free to add that to the survey so we can kind of formally capture it. We'll also be saving the chat log, so we'll have this too. So Michelle has a question, which is, do you know if Section 8 voucher has a third party processing the lottery winner? So I think that's a question about how we're prioritizing vouchers, perhaps. Howard, do you want to take that first? Then I can
Sure. So the Marin Housing, with the approval of the supervisors, has a set aside of up to 50 vouchers, Section 8 vouchers annually that are prioritized by coordinated entry procedures, and coordinated entry uses the VI, well, I won't go into the technical, but it uses a vulnerability assessment to put the most vulnerable people first. And so those are the people who get prioritized. So it's not a lottery when it comes through coordinated entry. It's based on an assessment of who's the most vulnerable in the community. And so there's no waiting list for coordinated entry. Vulnerability can change over time. So somebody who might have been lower might bounce higher to the top at a particular moment because they had a heart attack or they've been in the hospital multiple times. So I don't know if that answered your question, Michelle. Is that kind of what you were getting at?
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, one of our big challenges the past few years is that the housing authority, we actually have a pretty highly effective housing authority. We've had good utilization with our vouchers and things like that. But nationally, at least the past few years, the federal government was really not supportive, let's say, of expanding, I think, Section 8 vouchers or housing support to people, low-income families and individuals across the country. So we were often in a situation where they were just, the budget there at the housing authority was just frozen and we couldn't even issue vouchers. So I would say, just generally speaking, with the new administration, it seems like there's signals from HUD that the Biden administration might be putting more support towards rolling out even more housing vouchers nationally. So maybe eventually there is more general availability, but right now it's not on a lottery system. And then Karen's question about, I assume children are most vulnerable. So we do have, there is a special version of that vulnerability assessment Howard mentioned that's specifically for families. And so we're actively maintaining a by name list of both sheltered and unsheltered families in the county. And I don't know, Howard, do you want to say anything about children specifically? I mean, it's definitely.
I mean, we, in our coordinated entry system, we make sure that families are well represented, but they get measured against family vulnerability, which is a different scale than individual. So, you know, we definitely need more units, more vouchers. Our goal, I don't know if Andrew mentioned it, our goal is to really see if we can end veteran and chronic homelessness in Marin, and we really think it's achievable, but we do need some more.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Well, I think that's it. And we are getting close to 1, so I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I know this was a great session. Howard, anything you want to add, or again, really great questions.
Yeah, we could use all the support out there in the community. It's a great opportunity for us.
Absolutely.
How do we sign up for future sessions? Andrew, you want to put in the link? I think was in there at the top.
Marin County.
There used to be a waiting list for vouchers. It's huge. People have been waiting since 2005, I understand, or longer. So right now, people are pulled for vouchers based on coordinated entry in general.
And I just dropped in the info page from the county about Homekey. Just be mindful. I think it's still, we're in the process of updating for 2.0 while there's still a little bit of information from 1.0. So all the sessions, the future sessions are linked there if you want to sign up for another one. We're going to be doing 5 more this week, and then they'll be kind of probably ad hoc after that. And then also for everyone that attended today, everyone that RSVP'd and couldn't make it, I will be sending out probably, I think these conclude on Thursday, maybe Friday. I'll be sending out a follow-up email to everyone that registered with all of the recordings that you can view, as well as the slides, if anyone wants to review the slides. And then we'll also have you on the Opening Doors mailing list, so we can keep you posted about any kind of upcoming events you might want to know about. So that is, yeah, we'll make sure to keep you informed.
Appreciate everybody being here.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Yeah. Thank you, Howard, for joining, and really appreciate everyone's time. All the best. Take care.
Bye-bye.